Right, good. We sorted it. Well done, everybody. It's an absolute honor to introduce Greg today. Like I say, he's a colleague, but I would consider him a friend. He's worked with me on, helped me work through a lot of different things, but also became one of the sort of main voices I ended up drawing on for the book as well, which I wasn't expecting, but his way with explaining the sort of constituent elements of these cultural forms has been brilliant, and I think has really helped me understand it over the last few years. But also his book, Say Hello to Metamodernism, which has just come out as well, is really accessibly written for that as well. So I do recommend it. So Greg Dember is an independent researcher and co-founder of the What is Metamodern website with Linda Seriello, PhD. And Greg's writing on metamodernism in popular culture, with a specific emphasis on music, has helped popularize the terminology outside of academic discourse through accessible writing. He's the author of the oft-cited article 11 Metamodern Methods in the Arts in 2019, and the general audience book Say Hello to Metamodernism 2024. He co-coordinated the Seattle Metamodernism Summit in 2022 and has presented several papers on metamodernism at academic conferences. And I'm happy to say he is here today. Let me just move you to the other screen, Greg. There we go.
All right.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Tom. I'm thrilled to be part of the launch of your wonderful book. And I'm thrilled to be part of this general symposium on performance arts. And hello to everybody, both online and in person at the event. I'm speaking to you from Seattle on the West Coast of the United States. And I want to thank Tom for readjusting the schedule so that I didn't have to speak at the absolute crack of dawn. But I'm actually awake by now. I think it's going to be okay. It might have been more logical to have me go first, because I'm going to be presenting kind of on a metamodernism on a more general level beyond theater. But I think this actually, the way it worked out is good, because Tom got to get right into metamodern theater specifically to, kind of show why metamodernism matters to theater for all of you. But now I'm going to kind of back it out and talk about metamodernism on a broader level. Tom and I have both recently released books about metamodernism. I'm different from Tom in that I'm not an academic, and my book is geared towards an audience of what I hope are, what I think of as kind of interested, curious lay people. I have chapters in my book exploring metamodern through examples in film and music and television and literary fiction, and even recent developments in philosophy and religion. But the book begins with an overview, and in the overview, I offer my own particular model on metamodernism. And I'm going to use this talk to present my model of kind of how the aesthetics of metamodernism work. And I'm also going to begin with my model of the kind of overarching scheme of aesthetic periods that precede metamodernism and that metamodernism emerged from. So I'm going to start reading from my prepared notes now. In this talk, I'm going to sketch out my own notion of metamodernism and the cultural periodization model that it is part of. Rather than taking it as claiming to be singularly authoritative in any sense, I would invite you to treat it as a particular example of a theory about metamodernism. My belief is that there is something going on in culture that a bunch of us have noticed, that we're largely noticing roughly the same thing, and that many of us have slightly different ways of using language and concepts to explain it. And of course, many of us share the choice of using metamodernism as our signifier for this cultural pattern. So this is just a picture of two people who are observing the same actual thing in reality, but they might each have slightly different ways of theorizing them. As a side note, it is important to remember that metamodernism is just a word, and its meaning has not coalesced definitively yet. There are writers out there who use the term as their name for things that to me are very different from what those of us participating in the symposium mean by it. So in this picture, they're both using the term metamodernism, but they're looking at different things. And so there are people who use the word metamodernism not just as an expansive extension kind of the central meaning that we're using, but as essentially completely different meanings. I'm not going to belabor this point, but if you're wondering how we can decide which construals of metamodernism belong together and which don't, I will concede that there is no cut and dried objective answer. But what I suggest is looking at the things that the different models categorize as metamodern and making a judgment about how similar they are. Are they the same things? Great. Are they different things? In that case, do they have similar attributes? And do they feel the same? As Tom has put forth in his book, recognizing a certain feeling has to be one part of how we identify metamodernism out in the world. And it's just occurring to me now that that is kind of a meta-modern approach to resolving kind of, some of these questions about how the terminology is used, is we want to both allow for, some flux and flexibility in how the term is used, but yet we can also trust our feeling of, no, here we're actually talking about two different things. So now I'll offer an outline of my model of metamodernism, with all that having been said, beginning with the framework I've adopted for understanding the periods that came before metamodernism. Metamodernism, of course, is generally understood in relation to other periods that precede it: postmodernism, modernism before that, and, in my nomenclature, tradition, as the departure point for all of them. The term I use for these historical periods, which can also sometimes be thought of as free-floating cultural sensibilities, is episteme. Following my thinking partner, Linda Ceriello, I borrow this term and concept from Foucault, for whom an episteme was the cultural unconscious of a time and place, especially regarding how we relate to knowing. So each episteme expresses a particular orientation towards knowing or a particular preoccupation. In my model, traditional culture is preoccupied with preserving the stability of communal knowledge passed from previous generations and assuring the individual's place in established social institutions. It is open to very gradual change, but primarily enshrines that which has come before, that which has always been. Artists, storytellers, and wisdom bearers who operate within this episteme seek to excel according to standards that they learned from their mentors, who learned them from their mentors, and on back ad infinitum. Truth is defined in terms of what, quote unquote, everybody already, quote unquote, knows, or according to ancient texts that are believed to be unchanging, infallible, and possibly divinely inspired. I'm feeling self-conscious using the construction quote unquote, because I think in Britain, you guys call quotation marks inverted commas, so I don't know how you designate that you're reading something that has designated commas or inverted commas around it, but I mean, that's what I mean when I go quote unquote. If you could see me, and I didn't, maybe you even can, I'd be holding up my little fingers, making that sign. Anyway, modernism, as I understand it, is culture preoccupied with invention, liberation from the past, and the discovery of objective underlying universal truths to replace blindly accepted just so stories. So modernism's relation to knowing is the premise that the best way to access the truth is through the application of human rationality and ingenuity, and by looking underneath accumulated surfaces and behind arbitrary veils to find meaningful structures. In relation to metamodernism, when I discuss modernism, I'm usually talking about the historical period that began slightly before the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, rather than about modernity, which for me is the much longer period that began with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Though that longer period also involves an emphasis on the discovery of knowledge through human invention, I would argue that in the early 20th century, that sensibility became much more intensively deliberate among artists and authors, thus the identification of a specialized period we call modernism. If the whole of modernism can be said to have one overarching goal, then it was to expose the untruths that had persisted in human culture due to allegiance to tradition and replace them with new and quote unquote more true truths discovered through rationality and fresh vision. That postmodernism, in turn, saw falsehood not only in the traditional beliefs that modernism disrupted, but in any attempt to assert a universal and unquestioned sense of reality, including, of course, the new models put forth under modernism. Or, to use a metaphor, if modernism's thing was to dig beneath the surface to find a solid objective fundamental reality, i.e., structuralism, then postmodernism is what you get when you realize that you can always keep digging and find another layer beneath the one that seemed like the ultimate foundation, i.e., post-structuralism or deconstruction. So postmodernism's relation to quote-unquote truth is an awareness that there cannot be any simple relation to the truth, resulting in a preoccupation with context, the blurriness of boundaries, the questioning of assumed categories, and the deployment of irony. As I've mentioned for my purposes, traditional culture is the glue. As I've mentioned, for my purposes, traditional culture is the glue that holds human communities together and connects the past to the present. Modernism is the impulse to transcend the limitations of traditional culture and to assert the power of the individual personality through rational thought. Postmodernism is a recognition of modernism's own limitations and resists the naive acceptance of unitary, universal narratives by emphasizing context, irony, self-reference, paradox, cultural diversity, play, and surface. It's not hard to see how postmodernism's aversion to depth and certainty would leave many people unsatisfied. In any case, it does seem that around the turn of our millennium, a lot of cultural creators found themselves weary of making art that fit the aesthetics and themes of the postmodern sensibility and began to move away from it towards yet something else new. This something new is what many of us are identifying as metamodernism. Skipping some historiography due to time constraints, I will introduce the most well-known way of explaining metamodernism from Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van Denneker's 2010 article, Notes on Metamodernism. Some of you may be very familiar with this quote, and for some of you it might be new, but it's a good one. Metamodernism oscillates between a modern enthusiasm and a postmodern irony, between hope and melancholy, between naivete and knowingness, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity. Indeed, by oscillating to and fro or back and forth, the metamodern negotiates between the modern and the postmodern. Each time the metamodern enthusiasm swings toward fanaticism, gravity pulls it back towards irony. The moment its irony sways toward apathy, gravity pulls it back towards enthusiasm. This definition of metamodernism, of course, emphasizes oscillation between modern and postmodern polarities. Vermeulen and von Denneker themselves do not necessarily limit their conception of metamodernism to such oscillation, and yet, for many people, that is what comes to mind when you bring up metamodernism. In the model I will present today, I place a preoccupation with interiority and felt experience, a need to defend these things against the potentially degrading effects of modernist reductionism, and postmodern relativism as the central motivation of metamodern artworks. So if an episteme is the cultural unconscious of an era with respect to how we relate to knowing. If tradition says we know things because of what has been passed down to us by elders and ancestors, if modernism says we know things through human rationality and ingenuity, if postmodernism is dubious at the prospect of knowing things at all, I propose that under metamodernism, the most important kind of knowing is that based on our felt experience. So, sure, what you think may be subject to cultural biases, to faulty premises, to the very limitations inherent in thinking itself. Ethical judgments about right and wrong may not be universally applicable. The very notion of a coherent, chronologically continuous self may be illusionary. But when individual experience ceases to claim to be anything beyond individual experience, what still remains is individual experience. Thoughts can be deceptive, but feelings cannot deceive, nor can they be explained away if feelings simply are what they are. Felt experience claims to be nothing more than it is, and therefore cannot be made to be less than it is. It's not always right in a factual way or even in a practical way, but from a metamodern point of view, felt experience is what connects someone to their self, to their truth in the moment. So in the model of metamodernism that I proposed, this preoccupation with felt experience lies at the center, and the oscillation across modern and postmodern polarities is very important, but is also one of 11 metamodern methods. It's also only one of 11 metamodern methods I've observed. And those are the 11 metamodern methods in a list. I will now give very brief, stripped down explanations of each of these methods. For the sake of brevity, I will give only one example with each method, and I'd like to note that almost all of these examples exhibit additional metamodern qualities beyond whichever one I'm drawing attention to. Also, for full disclosure, much of what I will read to you includes slightly modified excerpts from my book. Empathic reflexivity. Empathic reflexivity indicates an intensified looking back upon the self that draws attention towards felt experience. The self may be the author, the reader, the work itself, or even the genre or medium that the work is part of. Of course, reflexivity is not unique to metamodernism. It is also an important part of postmodern work, but it functions differently in the two epistemes. Empathic reflexivity is my term specifically for reflexivity that works in a metamodern context. So, for comparison, in a postmodern work, reflexivity's role is to dissolve boundaries and to call into question unexamined premises, to remind audiences that the work is indeed a piece of work and not to be entirely trusted. Metamodernism inherits reflexivity from postmodernism, but repurposes it. It can function in a variety of ways, but all of them serve to affirm felt experience. If the self being reflected upon in a metamodern work is the work's author, the result is a highlighting of lived inner experience. In this case, the author's own self-reflection provides a model for the reader's self-reflection, and by extension, the reader's own felt experience. If the self being referenced is the work's own form, genre, or medium, the effect is that the reader is reminded that they are engaging in something that has form, genre, or medium. In other words, it is some sort of an artwork that therefore has a reader, and of course the reader is the particular one doing the reading. Again, bringing focus on the experience of the individual engaging with the work. When metamodernism when metamodern empathically reflexive work features intertextuality, instead of being about dissolving boundaries between the work and the work's context, as happens in postmodernism, it more has the function of saying, I'm a work that lives in a world filled with other works, just like you do, reader. I'm here to reflect your experience. An example is Community, a television series created by Dan Harmon that ran from 2009 to 2015. The show features frequent examples of empathic reflexivity, including an autism spectrum character who understands and connects with other people via television tropes, living, in a sense, as if he and all of those whom he cares about are part of some sort of on-screen existence. Next method is the narrative double frame. The notion of the narrative double frame is borrowed from theorist Raoul Eshelman, who proposed it as a literary device in his 2008 book, Performatism, which offers another theory of what comes after postmodernism. The double frame is a narrative structure involving an outer frame and an inner frame locked together. The outer frame is a world story imbued with enough fantasy elements that the reader is forced to make a choice to buy into all of it if they're going to commit to engaging any of it. Now, temporarily trapped inside this outer frame, they are free to unironically engage the emotional content of the inner frame, which is the story of a particular set of characters and events. In other words, the fantastic nature of the outer frame draws a clear boundary between the narrative and the quote-unquote real world, and the reader is left free to connect to the felt experience of the characters and, through extension, to her own inner life, free from postmodern considerations of context and relativism. An example is the film Beasts of the Southern Wild, directed by Ben Zeitlin from 2012, in which a young African-American girl and her dying father struggle with their relationship as rising waters flood their bayou community, and ancient giant beasts called aurochs emerge from the melting Arctic and travel ominously towards them. So in this case, the outer frame is determined by the fantasy element of the aurochs, and the inner frame is the compelling story of the community's plight and the emotional family dynamics. And then now here I have oscillation between modern and postmodern dualities as my third method. I've already introduced the idea of oscillation, as has Tom. The important thing to have in mind is that metamodern oscillation involves specifically modern versus postmodern dualities, not just any duality. So oscillating between chocolate and vanilla, whatever that would mean, is not metamodern. And more to the point, oscillating between two conflicting political positions is not metamodern per se. Oscillating in relation to pairs such as earnestness and irony or universality versus fragmentation, those are metamodern oscillations. An example is the Ben Folds Five, a rock band whose music is, by their own self-description, punk rock for sissies, suggesting a combination of aggressiveness and delicateness. The quirky. And so I just want to say, so to my point of, kind of there can be many different models of how metamodernism works. You see a lot of these methods I'm using are part of Tom's system, and then Tom has some additional ones that I don't have. We both have the quirky and several of the other ones that I'm mentioning, but I have some that he doesn't have, and he has some that I don't have. But I feel like we're talking about the same actual thing. So the quirky, historically, as a term, quirky emerged within the film scholarship of James McDowell, but it can be applied to work with similar characteristics in other areas such as music, television, and literature. Quirky offers an alternative to the irony versus earnestness schism by presenting characters who are heroically weird. Characters who, through their own eccentricity, reveal something simultaneously outside of the norm and universal in the way it gives access to the kind of vulnerability that everyone experiences. In a sense, quirky can be thought of as a particular sort of double frame that encloses a single character instead of an entire narrative. The eccentricity is the outer frame, which, with its adamant irreducibility, prevents irony from dissolving the inner frame, which is the character's emotional truth or felt experience. New Girl, a television series starring Zooey Deschanel that ran from 2011 to 2018, is an example. A group of young adults share an apartment, coping with and at times reveling in each other's eccentricities. The tiny, or metamodern minimalism. I'm using the term the tiny to distinguish a special metamodern kind of minimalism as distinct from other senses of minimalism. Metamodernism inherits minimalism as a possible method from both modernism and postmodernism, but puts it towards a somewhat different purpose. Where modernist works employ minimalism to reveal the underlying structures of things by stripping away excess, And postmodernism works employ minimalism to undercut modernism's penchant for grand narratives and its tendency to preach more, newer, better, faster, bigger in all things. Metamodern artworks use what I'm calling the tiny in order to create vulnerability and intimacy, bringing the reader of a work closer to the felt experience expressed therein. My example here is mumblecore as a film genre in general. Writers and directors such as Lynn Shelton, Andrew Bujalski, and brothers Mark and Jay Duplass created films characterized by low-budget production, low-key plots, improvised dialogue, and often using non-professional actors. The genre is self-mockingly called mumblecore because seemingly very little happens beyond a bit of mumbled dialogue. Nevertheless, great depths of emotional connection are transmitted through this mumbling. The epic, or metamodern maximalism, is a rebellion against postmodernism's tendency to shame ebullient, unabashed self-expression. With the epic, I'm talking about extravagant performances, lush musical arrangements, cautionless embrace of technology, over-the-top sexuality, excesses that don't stop at just being provocative, but engage grandiose, hero-filled storytelling. Metamodernism gives us permission for all of these things, but again, not towards a randomness or anarchic or destructive impulse. The epic is metamodernism's version of maximalism. The Flaming Lips are a rock band that exemplify the epic. Their concerts involve huge bombastic set designs and amusement park-like special effects. Constructive pastiche, another method that originated in the postmodern episteme but takes a different role in metamodernism, is pastiche. I would venture that in the context of metamodernism, pastiche is constructive, whereas under postmodernism, it was dissociative. Dissociative pastiche, and I've pastiche, this is just a side note, is I use pastiche to mean and I know that others do as well. I use pastiche to mean the pasting together of disparate elements. Um, and I know that it is often used simply to mean the bringing of an element from a previous time period into the present self-consciously. But here I'm kind of suggesting a leaning together of disparate elements that come from different genres. So dissociative pastiche pitted elements against each other. Dissociative pastiche, the postmodern kind, pitted elements against each other with results that were usually amusingly absurd in order to call into question the unexamined premises of each. What I call metamodern constructive pastiche, on the other hand, combines disparate elements to build a space inhabited by a felt experience that is not at home in either element on its own. And/or constructive pastiche allows, inside a work of art, the kinds of cultural combinations that people experience in real life, despite conventional divisions between them. An example is the 2022 film Everything Everywhere All at Once, which draws on tropes from science fiction, martial arts action films, immigrant family, queer coming of age, comedy, and surrealism. And yet it brings all of these things together in order to tell a very heartfelt story about family reconciliation. And I'd like to note that Daniel Kwan, one of the two directors of the film, actually used the term metamodernism to describe his film in an interview in the magazine Mashable. Ironicity is my neologism, referring to the braiding together of earnestness and irony. In a sense, it's a special case of metamodern oscillation that deserves its own name. Ironicity is irony, sarcasm, sardonicness, and/or snark employed in the surface of making an honest, earnest point or expressing a heartfelt emotion. It's a kind of way of saying, hey, I get what I'm about to say is kind of corny, but, and then truly caring about the thing that comes after the but. Or it's a way of delivering a humorous, clever, ironic message, but softening it with a, don't worry, we're not too cool for you. We have sincere feelings just like you. For example, Jury Duty, a 2023 television show, which is a reality show, but for one character only. And that character doesn't know that all of the other cast members are actors following a script. The series simultaneously sends up reality show cliches and offers scenarios that allow the victim of the hoax to demonstrate his humanity and authentic compassion and generosity, even while, as the audience, you're constantly laughing at him because he doesn't know what's going on. I'm almost getting to the end. This is method number 9. Normcore, a term made well known in 2013 by trend-watching marketing consulting outfit K-Hole. Normcore is a deliberate effort by people who have a non-mainstream or artistic identity to adopt the fashion sensibilities and general demeanor of quote-unquote normal people. It is quietly, radically metamodern in that it emphasizes relationality. It emphasizes relationality, the ability to connect to one's own and other people's inner experience over externally focused preoccupations with cultural groups and with categorical identities that seek to differentiate one from others. Normcore is hard to give examples for because the point of normcore is to not stand out. But one example is the indie rock band Death Cab for Cutie, who rather than trying to look like rockers, punks, goths, or some other subcultural type, simply sported polo shirts, slacks, and work shoes for their concerts and press photos. Overprojection or anthropomorphizing. The projection of human personality onto non-human creatures or inanimate objects has certainly been happening throughout the various epistemic periods, but it can be taken as a metamodern method when it is used for showcasing inner felt experience, especially when it occurs in response to postmodern tendencies that tend to smirk at interiority. In effect, the author slash work slash reader is filled up with felt experience to the point where it spills over and imbues itself in non-human entities. Some examples are the 1997 redesign of the Volkswagen Beetle and the original 1998 Apple iMac. Both products were designed to look like they have faces in a playful manner that invited a warm reaction from purchasers. And my last method, metacute. This element overlaps with both overprojection and quirky. It has to do with things that evoke childlike innocence and simplicity, but are meant for usage by adults. In a sense, it's a way of puncturing modernist over-seriousness, but in a way that is kind, rather than postmodernly biting. An example is the film Jojo Rabbit. His protagonist is an endearingly naive boy, while the film's subject matter, the Holocaust, and its other themes are very much meant for an adult audience. Again, this list of metamodern methods is simply an attempt to have a language for dissecting the metamodern tendency. It's not meant to be exhaustive or unrevisable, nor is it meant to stand against other such systems developed by others. It's more of a, here's some of what I've observed out there kind of thing. In my book, Say Hello to Metamodernism, I utilize this set of constructs to interpret and reveal the metamodern sensibility that lives in a bunch of films, musical acts, TV shows, novels, and philosophical and religious developments. One area I very notably do not cover, however, is theater. I look forward to the remaining presentations as we collectively explore how the spirit of metamodernism inhabits contemporary performance arts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you so much for your very early morning presentation for us as well. Loads to think about there, and I hope that we've had a bit of an overview of metamodernism, both within theatre and beyond, at the start of today. We're going to take a short break.